Prior to studying British colonial administration techniques, he had served as a cavalry officer in the Bavarian army. Following his research, he was reassigned to oversee German territories in Southwest Africa. Heinrich's tenure as minister-resident for Southwest Africa proved relatively brief, as he was soon appointed ambassador to Haiti. Hermann Göring's mother, Franziska Tiefenbrunn, had previously given birth to 3 other children, Karl, Olga, and Paula, before Hermann. After Göring was born, his mother returned to Haiti without him, entrusting his care to a family acquaintance in Fürth, Bavaria. For the subsequent 3 years, Göring resided with the Gauff family, harboring significant resentment towards his mother for leaving him behind. When they were finally reunited in 1896 and she attempted to embrace him, Göring lunged at his mother, attempting to strike her for having been absent for such an extended period. The family subsequently relocated to Berlin and settled in Fregestrasse, situated in the Friedenau suburb. From a very young age, Göring harbored a strong desire to join the German military as an officer, emulating his father. The family dynamics underwent a considerable transformation during Göring's childhood. Dr. Hermann Eppenstein, his father's friend and Hermann's godfather, lavished attention and gifts upon the Göring children. When Dr. Eppenstein returned to Germany, he acquired Mautendorf Castle in Austria, located not far from the Bavarian border. He also later purchased a second, smaller castle named Weldenstein near the city of Nuremberg. Göring would come to regard Weldenstein as the family's noble residence, yet its acquisition was solely made possible by his wealthy godfather. Dr. Eppenstein was also on friendly terms with Franziska, and she subsequently became Eppenstein's mistress, which brought humiliation upon her frail husband. When Eppenstein visited, he was given the most opulent bedroom, with Franziska's chamber situated nearby, while Heinrich was relegated to the ground floor and prohibited from entering that section of the castle. Eppenstein largely took over the care of the children, meaning Heinrich played little to no part in Göring's upbringing. Dr. Eppenstein identified as Christian, having been baptized in childhood, yet his family lineage was Jewish. He frequently corresponded with the Görings, offering guidance on directing their children's lives in matters such as education, marriage, and financial investments. While Göring's father was preoccupied with his past glories, his godfather embodied true influence and stature. Nevertheless, Göring resented the relationship between Eppenstein and his mother. He was accustomed to being indulged as a child and received minimal discipline, later referring to himself as "Daddy's darling." He proved to be a difficult student, leaving his first school in Fürth in 1900. In 1904, he was sent to a boarding school in Ansbach, which he detested so intensely that he used his last remaining money for a ticket home, ensuring he cut all the strings on the school's musical instruments before departing. His parents insisted he return to school, but he steadfastly refused. He found it impossible to endure the restrictions imposed upon him at Ansbach, and he perceived his defiance towards authority figures as a manifestation of inherent heroism. His father would often say that historical greatness ran through their blood, a phrase that would inspire Göring towards pursuing a grand vision. In 1905, his father and Eppenstein jointly agreed to send him to the cadet school at Karlsruhe in Baden. Ironically, neither anticipated Göring's positive reaction to the idea of attending the academy, as he believed it was finally an institution suitable for a hero. By 1909, he had enrolled in a military training college located at Lichterfelde, near Berlin. He found enjoyment in the daily routine of military life and also in his solitary evenings spent alone. He graduated from Lichterfelde with the highest possible distinction from the academy, and by March 1912, he had become a member of the Prince Wilhelm Regiment. He was assigned to the 112th Infantry Regiment, stationed at Mühlhaus, and by 1913, Göring received his commission as an officer. It was only a year later, in 1913, that the fragile friendship with Eppenstein would end, leading to the family being forced out of Weldenstein. As a result, Heinrich moved the family to Berlin, and he passed away shortly thereafter. Although the loss of his father was deeply upsetting, Göring settled into life at Mühlhaus and formed a friendship with Lieutenant Bruno Lürzer. Mühlhaus was a border garrison town in German Alsace, with a distance of no more than a mile separating Germany and France. Meanwhile, in Sarajevo in 1914, the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a member of Young Bosnia. This assassination triggered the July Crisis, which led to the deterioration of diplomatic relations among European nations. Upon the declaration of war, Lieutenant Göring and his men were ordered to withdraw behind the Rhine River to assume a more advantageous defensive position, and the French quickly occupied the town. One of Göring's initial assignments was to provide a scouting report on the French disposition in Mulhouse. However, Göring, propelled by the intensity of the moment, drove the French forces out of the town. He seized 4 French dragoon horses and returned to base with these spoils of war. The following day, Göring and his platoon entered the town on bicycles and engaged the French troops in a skirmish, causing them to retreat in disarray. Göring's success prompted him to devise a plan to capture General Paul Pau. However, a nervous rifleman compromised their position by accidentally discharging his weapon. With their location exposed, the platoon returned to base empty-handed, leaving Göring feeling resentful about the missed opportunity to achieve instant fame. Göring matured into an experienced and dependable junior officer, but was unexpectedly incapacitated by rheumatism. He was admitted to a hospital in Freiburg to recuperate and maintain contact with Lürser, who had entered an air training program. Undertaking aerial reconnaissance occupied much of Göring's spring in 1915. He eventually learned Morse code, enabling him to transmit messages down to the base while airborne. The first Morse code message he sent was quoted as, "You can stop firing, you won't hit the bloody target anyhow." When the French Air Force launched a raid on the Crown Prince's headquarters during Crown Princess Cecilia's visit, Göring and Lürser responded by severely damaging a French aircraft with a pistol before dropping a small bomb on a French airfield. As a consequence of this raid, Göring decided to carry an improvised machine gun during flights, becoming the first German airman to bring a machine gun into aerial combat. Once aviation technology had advanced, Göring decided he wished to pilot his own aircraft rather than being confined to the role of an observer. Göring and Lürser attended senior meetings despite their relatively low rank, but their aerial experience proved too valuable for them to be excluded. At this time, he attracted the notice of Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm and returned to Freiburg to qualify as a pilot. He never crashed an aircraft during his training, and in October 1915, he earned the designation of Jagdflieger, also known as a pursuit fighter. Following the attainment of his new title, Göring and Lürser became members of Jagdstaffel 5, the newly formed fighter group assigned to operate on the Western Front. Göring experienced aerial combat in November when he engaged a new British aircraft, a Handley Page. This was a large aircraft for the period, accommodating a crew of 2, the pilot and one other individual who would observe, perform repairs, and fire at enemy aircraft. However, Göring's aviatic possessed greater maneuverability than the Handley Page, allowing him to outmaneuver it and neutralize its gunner. In the interim, Lürser was appointed as Commandant of Field Squadron 26, stationed in Mulhouse, where Göring would join him in 1916. Göring's reputation as a fighter pilot had become widespread, and he received the Zähring Lion with swords, the Karl Friedrich Order, along with the third-class Hohenzollern Medal with swords. In May 1917, he was given command of the 27th Air Squadron, which operated from the same airfield as the 26th Squadron near Flanders. Göring and Lürser's squadrons were later combined to form a new unit called the Jagdgeschwader, led by Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron. In 1918, Germany initiated an offensive against the Triple Entente on the Western Front. However, by April, Richthofen was killed in action, leading to Göring's swift advancement through the ranks. In May, Göring was preparing for takeoff when his adjutant stopped him, informing him that he had been awarded the Pour le Mérite, the most distinguished honor that could be conferred upon an individual for sustained valor on the battlefield. Richthofen was soon replaced by Captain Reinhardt in May, but Reinhardt was killed shortly after crashing an experimental aircraft that Göring himself had recently flown. On July 7th, Göring was selected to command the Jagdgeschwader, and during a ceremony he was presented with the Richthofen emblem, a walking stick that had been passed down by the unit's previous commanders. Göring retained this walking stick with him until the day he died. As the war's conclusion drew near, the orders received by the soldiers became increasingly confusing and contradictory. For example, on November 10th, he received instructions directing him to surrender their planes to the American forces, while another order instructed him to evacuate all their equipment to Darmstadt. Then on November 11th, the official news of the armistice reached the troops, accompanied by the directive to cease all evacuations, but Göring refused. Instead, he instructed his pilots to fly to Darmstadt. However, some, as intended, surrendered to the French at Strasbourg, while others misinterpreted Göring's orders and flew to Mannheim. There, soldiers and workers' councils had revolted and confiscated the pilots' firearms. Word of this reached Göring, and without hesitation, he and the remainder of his squadron flew to Mannheim. Göring threatened to open fire on the airfield if the weapons were not returned, and the revolutionaries complied. The squadron proceeded to Darmstadt, where Göring ordered them to deliberately crash-land their aircraft to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Göring received an honorable discharge from the German Air Force with the rank of captain in the Bavarian town of Aschaffenburg. It was here that he discovered his talent as a public speaker. His men would frequently applaud him as he delivered impassioned speeches against the German people for what he perceived as their betrayal of the army, which had made immense sacrifices to protect them. Göring led a peripatetic existence following his departure from the military and spent some time residing in Denmark. In 1920, Count Erich von Rosen, a noted explorer, asked Göring to transport him by air to his estate situated on Lake Bavin. The weather conditions were severe, and by the time they landed on the frozen lake, it was too late for Göring to attempt the return journey. Count Rosen extended an invitation for Göring to spend the night in the castle, where he would be introduced to Count Rosen's wife's sister, Baroness Karin von Kanzow. Göring swiftly became enamored with the woman during the evening, as the group engaged in singing songs. Karin was 5 years Göring's senior, was married, and had an 8-year-old son. However, she was estranged from her Swedish husband and was seeking the love and affection that Göring offered. By the end of Göring's visit, they had made arrangements to meet Karin's parents at their residence in Sweden. Karin's father was Baron Karl von Frick, an officer in the Swedish army, while her mother was Baroness Huldini Beamish-Falk, an Englishwoman whose family had resided in Ireland. Karin's sister Fanny was married to Count Richard von Wilhelmowitz-Mellendorf, who had been an officer in the German army but had been killed during the Great War. The loss of her brother-in-law made her sympathetic towards Germany as well as towards Göring. However, the prospect of divorce coupled with Göring's unemployed status rendered the match improbable. Consequently, Göring returned to Berlin in 1921 to enroll in university and study political science at the age of 28. Meanwhile, Karin convinced her husband to grant her a divorce, and he even provided her with a sum of money that would enable her to marry Göring. The couple married in Munich on February 3, 1922, and relocated to Hochkreuz in the Bavarian Alps, approximately 50 miles from Munich. The couple were fervent nationalists, and it was not long before they became involved in political affairs. Göring met Hitler in 1922 and soon assumed an active role within the party. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, also known as the Nazi Party, was based in Munich as the Bavarian government proved ineffective in managing radical political factions. The heart of the party resided in the Sturmabteilung, SA, an organization comprised of individuals from the working class and former military personnel. Their functions included safeguarding party gatherings and initiating confrontations with members of other political factions. Indeed, the NSDAP was a relatively welcome political entity, largely because they frequently assaulted the Communist Party, which was viewed with considerable disfavor following its removal from power. Given Göring's interest in the party and his prior military background, Hitler extended Göring an offer to assume the leadership role within the Sturmabteilung. Göring articulated two main objectives for his tenure as leader. He stated, quote, "At first it was important to weld the SA into a stable organization, to discipline it, and to make of it a completely reliable unit, which had to carry out the orders which I or Adolf Hitler should give it. I strive from the beginning to bring into the SA those members of the party who were young and idealistic enough to devote their free time and their entire energies to it. In the second place, I tried to find recruits among laborers. Göring's accomplishments during the Great War made him an ideal candidate to head the SA, as he was highly respected by counter-revolutionaries and nationalists alike, individuals keen on dismantling the Communist Party. These men were essential for formulating the NSDAP's ascent and were precisely the kind of individuals Göring felt comfortable associating with. Both Göring and Röhm had similar relationships with Hitler. Hitler possessed a knack for harnessing the best qualities in his leaders while simultaneously managing their more unruly tendencies. Furthermore, Röhm's active status within the Bavarian military facilitated easy recruitment into the SA. While Röhm regarded Göring more as a competitor than an ally, his own memoirs never explicitly conveyed his disdain for the man. After all, Göring was valuable due to his more even temper and reluctance to make impulsive decisions, unlike Röhm, who was given the title of Chief of Staff of the SA. However, it was Göring who was truly in command. Röhm would not officially receive command of the SA until 1930. Nevertheless, throughout 1923, Göring meticulously organized and trained the SA in the wooded areas surrounding Munich and maintained a cautious relationship with the state government. Violence erupted between the Communists and Nazis on May 1, 1923, a day traditionally used for communist rallies. As a consequence of the May 1st incident, Göring and the others were compelled to reevaluate their strategy for expanding the NSDAP. It wasn't long before Hitler and Göring were both appealing to General von Lossow for support, as Gustav Stresemann had assumed the chancellorship and implemented martial law, recognizing the escalating political unrest. This declaration was partly prompted by the actions of the Black Reichswehr, led by Major Buchrucker, which now posed a threat to the government. The Black Reichswehr was a clandestine faction within the Reichswehr linked to the secret society known as FEMI, an organization marked by extreme brutality, surpassing even the street violence perpetrated by the Nazis and communists. Stresemann's opposition to passive resistance against the French occupation of the Ruhr region deeply angered many Germans, especially the Nazi Party. Göring attempted one final time to convince General von Lossow to break his commitment to aligning with Berlin in order to join them in a coup to overthrow Stresemann and his government. This plan did not materialize, leaving Hitler and Göring without a crucial ally. However, a prime opportunity soon presented itself, prompting the necessity for immediate action. Gustav von Kahr, the new state commissioner of Bavaria, Colonel Hans Ritter von Seisser, the premier of Bavaria, and General von Lossow had announced a meeting for November 8, 1923. Hitler stormed the beer hall, leaped onto a table, and fired a shot into the air, proclaiming, "The national revolution has begun." Hitler gestured with his gun, motioning for the ministers to leave the room. Göring, assessing the crowd's reaction, stepped up to the podium and shouted, "There is nothing to fear. We are your friends. You've no reason to grumble. You've got your beer." Meanwhile, Hitler and the ministers, under duress, were to form the new government, believing General Ludendorff would be involved, despite Ludendorff himself being unaware of any such involvement. Ludendorff soon arrived and was furious at not having been consulted about the plan. Yet a problem arose when Hitler had to leave to quell a street fight between the SA and Bavarian soldiers, leaving Ludendorff in charge of the ministers. The ministers departed and abandoned the plot. Kahr quietly moved the state government to Regensburg, printed pamphlets denouncing their allegiance to the Nazi Party, and ensured the military was not aligned with the Nazis. Meanwhile, Göring finally found a moment to telephone Karin to reassure her and inform her that he might not return home that night. Even during the coup, his primary concern was for Karin. The situation continued to deteriorate as Hitler and Göring did not act as swiftly as Röhm, who had successfully occupied the military headquarters in Munich. As morning arrived, Ludendorff proposed that the group march to the center of Munich, believing that the army and police would not fire on them due to his reputation. By 11 in the morning, Ludendorff led the column of Nazis towards the heart of Munich. The column of 3,000 had to cross the Ludwig Bridge to reach the inner city, but armed policemen were obstructing their path. Göring approached alone, informing the officers that they held hostages and that if force were used against the Nazis, the hostages and those who resisted would be shot. The police stood down and allowed the column to advance, but their weapons were confiscated as a precaution. The group continued through Zweibrückenstrasse, heading towards the War Ministry, where Rome was being besieged. However, to reach it, they had to pass through the narrow street of Residenzstrasse, which was blocked by armed police. The Nazis shouted at the police to surrender, but shots were fired and the Nazis scattered. Göring sustained a gunshot wound to the groin and was bleeding heavily from his injury. He was carried by stormtroopers into the house of the furniture dealer named Ballin and his wife Ilse, who ironically were Jewish. Ilse dressed the wound as best she could. Following the operation, Göring suffered from high fevers and agonizing pain, for which he was administered morphine twice daily. As a result, Göring would contend with morphine addiction for the remainder of his life. Göring spent a considerable amount of time in exile, prohibited from returning to Germany by Hitler, who refused to allow him to face trial for the failed putsch. His first engagement would be in February 1924, when he was scheduled to speak at a nationalist convention in Innsbruck. Göring soon assumed a leadership role for the Nazi Party in Vienna and collaborated closely with Austrian Nazi Walter Riehl. He resided at the Tiroler Hof with Karen and could barely afford their stay, with most of their possessions having been impounded by the Bavarian authorities. At the conclusion of the trial in April, Ludendorff was acquitted while Hitler was found guilty, along with other Nazi leaders, including Göring, who was found guilty in absentia. Göring applied for amnesty but never received it. The outcomes of the trial should have marked the end of the Nazi Party, but instead they resulted in a resurgence, leading to the Nazis securing seats in the Reichstag. The Görings left Austria and traveled through Italy before stopping in Rome. They were granted an audience with Benito Mussolini, where they discussed at length the failed beer hall putsch. Following their brief stay in Italy, the couple relocated to a flat in Odengatan, Sweden, to care for Karin's mother. However, Karin's own health soon began to decline as she started experiencing epileptic seizures. As she suffered more from the epileptic episodes, Göring's health also deteriorated due to his morphine addiction. In 1927, Paul von Hindenburg was elected president and issued a general political amnesty, which included Göring, who eagerly returned to his homeland. Göring worked diligently to rebuild his wealth and connect with Hitler for both employment and political purposes. Göring's former position as the leader of the SA was currently held by Franz von Pfeffer, a wealthy aristocrat whom Hitler could not afford to dismiss due to his economic advantages. The Nazi Party was financially weak and required strong economic supporters to succeed, and Göring's precarious financial status did not benefit them. Despite this, Göring was welcomed back into the Nazi Party and dispatched to Berlin to focus on accumulating wealth. It was at this time that Göring's connections within the airline industry proved beneficial. His friend Erhard Milch, a senior executive at Lufthansa, secured him a position working as a business representative for the Bavarian Motor Works Company. By the winter, Göring had successfully persuaded Hitler that he should be one of the representatives for the Nazi Party in the upcoming Reichstag election. He demonstrated to Hitler that he had a chance of success, as he stood against Otto and Gregor Strasser, the brothers who had earlier splintered from the Nazi movement due to their leftist ideology, eventually being pushed out by Hitler's cult of personality. In fact, Göring's role as a representative suited the Nazi Party well, as Göring possessed the ability to engage in conversation with the societal elite, whereas Hitler was poor at small talk and felt uncomfortable in the company of intellectuals. In the election, the Nazis performed poorly overall, but both Goebbels and Göring secured seats in the Reichstag. Hitler and Goebbels were less than pleased, but Göring was ecstatic as it replenished his family's depleted wealth and allowed them to move into a modern 5-room flat at 7 Badische Strasse. As a Reichstag deputy, he served on the Communications Committee, which also oversaw the aviation sector. He actively lobbied for increased funding for the airline industry, which was exclusively controlled by his friends at Lufthansa, arguing it was a, quote, great patriotic task that required fulfillment. In part, this was also a strategic move to build up Germany's military air defense capabilities. Göring's push to finance these major industrial entities also served as a means to incentivize industrialists to align with the Nazi Party. Following their success in the Reichstag, the Göring family experienced the loss of Karin's mother on September 25, 1931. Karin was barely well enough to attend the funeral in Stockholm, and Göring returned to Berlin to manage political affairs. However, on October 17th, Karin, who had been suffering from tuberculosis, succumbed to heart failure. Göring was devastated by the loss, and he returned to Berlin after the funeral, believing it was the only way he could cope with her death. After months of political turmoil and the resignation of multiple chancellors, Hitler ascended to the chancellorship on January 30th, 1933. The press reacted with jubilation to the Nazi Party's victory, and they took to the streets in celebration. Göring held 3 portfolios in Hitler's cabinet: Minister without portfolio, Minister of the Interior for Prussia, and Reich Commissioner of Aviation. As a minister without portfolio, he acted as an envoy, capable of speaking on behalf of Nazi Germany. While the Minister of the Interior for Prussia was technically under the supervision of former Chancellor von Papen, this position granted him authority over the police in the largest and most significant German state. Meanwhile, as the Reich Commissioner of Aviation, He had the distinguished role of developing the Air Force of the Reich. He also retained his position as president of the Reichstag until the Nazis dissolved the Reichstag on March 5, 1933. It would also be in early March that the concentration camps was established. However, Göring held a different perspective on their function compared to other Nazi leaders. He believed their role should be centered on re-education for those suffering from political delinquency. Röhm's demands were becoming increasingly audacious, and consequently Göring allied with Himmler to attempt to eliminate him. They required time before they could move against Röhm, but Göring's health was beginning to decline. Göring had become obese due to erratic eating habits and overindulgence when entertaining guests. His preferred foods included sandwiches and beer, along with his favorite, which was cake. Göring's sleeping patterns were no better. He would stay up late privately watching films, retiring at 2 or 3 a.m. and requesting to be awakened at 6:30, although Göring hardly needed to be roused as he suffered from insomnia. In May 1933, Hitler appointed Göring as Reich Master of the Hunt and Master of the German Forest. Göring had a deep affection for the countryside and quickly enacted laws to protect wildlife such as elk, bison, boars, swans, and birds of prey. He limited the number of permitted hunters and prohibited poaching, hunting on horseback, or the use of traps. His love of the forest also prompted him to acquire prime real estate in the Schorfheide, a vast area near the Baltic Sea and the Polish border. It was here near a lake called Wuckersee that he would construct Carenhall, where he would establish a sanctuary for both wildlife and himself. This would be a significant accomplishment for Göring, as he personally designed every aspect of the house, quote, down to the door handles. Just before Himmler assumed control of the Gestapo from Göring, Robert Diels approached him with a new device he had obtained abroad, capable of intercepting telephone calls. Göring handed it over to his agents and instructed his research staff officers to commence monitoring almost all high-ranking Nazi officials on Göring's designated list. Göring received a flood of information, including jokes made at his expense, but he appeared to find them amusing and would laugh about them. His most crucial wiretaps involved conversations between General Werner von Blomberg, Minister of Defense and head of the Reichswehr, Röhm, and Gruppenführer Karl Ernst. There were frequent discussions held by von Blomberg concerning anxieties surrounding Röhm's attempts to usurp control of the army, and his fears were substantiated by Röhm and Ernst's own exchanges. It also confirmed Göring's suspicions of Röhm's animosity towards him, as Röhm was overheard calling him the Pig Göring and Herr Reaction, or Mr. Reaction. Göring and Himmler's opportunity would arise when Röhm proposed a joint conference involving the SA, SS, and Reichswehr. This ignited growing resentment towards Röhm, and if Hitler would not restrain him, then the army would not support him. The SA was summoned to Bad Wiessee for a leadership conference, and it was there that the trap was sprung. Hitler and other top Nazi officials raided the Hanselbauer Hotel on June 30, 1934, and arrested Röhm and other SA leaders. Göring was in Berlin, raiding the SA headquarters, where he meticulously moved from room to room, pointing at individuals and ordering their arrest. The Night of the Long Knives, as it would become known, was an act of political suppression against both internal party members and outsiders, carried out to resolve political disagreements. The following year, on April 10, 1935, Göring proposed marriage to Emmy Sonnemann, an actress he had been dating since 1932. It was intended to be a grand event, marked by considerable pomp and circumstance, with the streets adorned for the occasion. Soldiers lined the streets leading to the cathedral, and all traffic was halted for the procession. Hitler served as Göring's best man at the wedding. There is also a possibility that the wedding took place at Hitler's suggestion, as he believed there were too many eligible men among the high-ranking Nazi members. Emmy was crowned as First Lady of the Third Reich by Hitler, and the couple retreated to Carenhall with a small entourage. Göring slipped away and spent an hour at Karen's tomb in the mausoleum. The next morning, Göring and Emmy departed for Wiesbaden and then proceeded to Yugoslavia for their honeymoon. Göring was promoted to Reichsmarschall on February 4, 1938, following Hitler's dismissal of 6 generals for anti-Nazi views and his self-appointment as Commander-in-Chief of the German Armed Forces. In March, Austria was invaded and incorporated into the Nazi Reich under Göring's purview. Following their annexation, the Austrian Nazi Party desired Göring to escalate propaganda against the Jewish population. Göring was hesitant as he enjoyed Jewish composers and painters, yet he believed they were guilty of profiteering and scheming, which he felt had contributed to Germany's defeat in World War I. In private conversations with Emmy, he would remark, quote, "The Jews were just like any other people, but a bit smarter," which he often said with a grin. He would also state that they had both good and bad individuals among them. He felt uneasy when Goebbels and Himmler spoke about the extermination of the Jews and would often excuse himself from such discussions. The Goerings had their first and only child, Etta, on June 2, 1938, and Hitler served as the newborn's godfather. In the following year, on September 1, 1939, German troops invaded Poland, and Göring would ascend to the zenith of his power. Hitler had designated Göring as his successor should anything ever happen to him. Hitler refused, believing Britain would surrender within the next few weeks, unlike Göring, who understood they would only capitulate once the final decisive blow had been delivered. The favorable weather conditions turned dreadful, preventing air operations, as Göring aimed for highly accurate bombing raids to obliterate ports, factories, and airfields. When the Luftwaffe was finally unleashed, they encountered stiff resistance from the RAF. The Luftwaffe suffered the loss of nearly 1,500 aircraft, having underestimated the advancements in British radar and code decryption. This marked the beginning of a year-long bombing campaign against England that became known as the Blitz. On August 9, 1940, Göring and Hitler had a disagreement over their next military moves. Hitler wished to attack the Soviet Union as a preemptive measure. Göring called Hitler out on his hypocrisy, as Hitler had stated in his biography Mein Kampf that he would never involve the German people in a two-front war, similar to the Great War. Hitler was outraged by Göring's dismissal of his plan, and even more so by Göring's continuing his argument despite being ignored. Hitler had become fixated on attacking the Soviet Union, and Göring pleaded with Hitler to consider Napoleon's failed attempt to conquer Russia as a comparable situation to dealing with the British, arguing that the Russians would not seek peace. In 1941, Göring became involved with his most notorious interest, his passion for art. Göring had long planned the Hermann Göring Museum, an art gallery he intended to open in 1953. He had a profound appreciation for Renaissance and Dutch paintings, being well-versed in both schools. He possessed 4 stately homes that required furnishing, and he found pleasure in gazing at paintings for hours. Göring employed multiple staff members who assisted him in acquiring the art. He even instructed them not to be concerned about the ethnicity of the individual selling the art and to focus solely on the artwork itself. When further anti-Jewish laws were enacted, Göring utilized his power to assist Jewish art dealers in relocating to Switzerland to avoid prosecution. Göring also collaborated closely with directors of national institutions, such as the Louvre, to construct special bunkers to safeguard the art from bombing raids. While Göring did protect some collections, he also plundered others, having trains loaded with art shipped back to Germany to be displayed in public museums or private collections. It was an impressive collection, with meticulous record-keeping by Andreas Hofer and his assistant Gisela Limburger. The pair created a detailed ledger that included photographs of every artwork, documenting when it was bought and sold, along with specific details of any restoration work performed. All revenue generated from the sale of art was directed towards the construction of the Hermann Göring Museum. On July 31, 1941, Göring issued an order to Himmler's key subordinate, Reinhard Heydrich, quote, to make necessary preparations for a total solution of the Jewish question. This directive would, in January 1942, culminate in Heydrich convening the infamous Wannsee Conference, where he outlined the plan for the extermination of millions of Jews across Europe in purpose-built death camps. Although Göring's involvement in the day-to-day operations of the final solution was limited, he did issue the fundamental order for the SS to commence operations to liquidate the Jewish population, and it was this command more than any other factor that would result in both Göring's death sentence at the Nuremberg trials and solidify his reputation as one of the primary instigators of the Holocaust. Hitler and Göring's relationship grew increasingly strained as the war progressed. The Allies became increasingly unopposed as the number of aircraft protecting German cities diminished. Hitler ordered an all-out assault on England by the Luftwaffe, an undertaking that was both impossible and suicidal, and Göring was deeply distressed by it. Hitler would neither accept Göring's advice nor his offer of resignation. Göring was trapped. As the Third Reich was disintegrating, Göring withdrew from the decision-making process, and he was not present during the D-Day invasion. His final act of influence was used to secure the release of his nephew, who had been arrested following the failed Operation Valkyrie. He was suspected of being part of the coup, but there was no evidence to substantiate this. As the Red Army advanced in 1945, they were closing in on Hall. Göring had the art removed and a demolition team rigged the house for demolition. As Germany collapsed, Göring and Emmy fled into Bavaria, where U.S. First Lieutenant Jerome N. Shapiro found him caught in a traffic jam and brought him into American custody. He observed how happy the Görings were to be found by the Americans, as if they were escaping a terrible nightmare. Göring was taken to the 7th Army Interrogation Center in Augsburg, and it was here that he spoke openly with the Americans. In their reports, they noted, quote, "Göring is by no means the comical figure he has been depicted so many times in the newspaper reports. He is neither stupid nor a fool, but generally cool and calculating. He is certainly not a man to be underrated. Although he tried to soft-pedal many of the most outrageous crimes committed by Germany, he said enough to show that he is as much responsible for the policies within Germany. Göring is at all times an actor who does not disappoint his audience." Göring provided a vivid, startling, and demonstrably authentic account of life in Nazi Germany, information that had eluded the Allies for so long. He informed the Allies that he had been unable to save all the art, and some had fallen into the hands of the Russians. Göring assisted the Allies in recovering all the art they could, except for those pieces that had ended up in Russian hands in Berlin. Göring was moved to a small suite at the Palace Hotel in Mondorf, Luxembourg. This facility served as the detention site for many high-ranking Nazis, including Joachim von Ribbentrop, Admiral Karl Dönitz, Albert Speer, and Hjalmar Schacht. There was a certain irony, as Dr. Robert M. Kempner was slated to prosecute the Nuremberg trials, and he had once been the youngest prosecuting counsel in the Prussian police department when Göring had dismissed him in 1933. Leading up to the trial, Göring underwent detoxification from morphine and lost a significant amount of weight. There were unannounced room inspections to ensure there was no contraband. Before the trial, Dr. Kempner indicted Göring on all 4 counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to plan and commit all 3. In response to the impending trial, he stated, quote, "It's just a cut and dried political affair, and I'm prepared for the consequences. I have no doubt that the media will exert a greater influence on the outcome than the judges themselves, and I am certain that the Russian and French judges at the very least have already received their instructions. I can account for everything I have done, and I cannot account for anything I have not done. But the victorious powers are the arbiters." The proceedings at Nuremberg witnessed the remaining Nazi leaders turning against each other, primarily Albert Speer and Göring. Göring attempted to maintain order among the other Nazis, but ultimately Speer prevailed. Colonel Andrus successfully devised a method to diminish Göring's influence by categorizing the lunch groups into specific divisions to minimize Göring's authority, and this strategy proved effective. The judges found Göring culpable on all 4 counts and sentenced him to capital punishment. Göring was scheduled for execution by hanging, but he requested a military execution by firing squad, viewing it as a soldier's end. His request was denied, and the prison security was reinforced to prevent the condemned war criminals from avoiding the gallows. In the conflict's final days, all Nazi leaders carried poison with them in anticipation of capture. However, medications were strictly supervised by the guards, precluding the possibility of poison capsules being provided to the defendants. The executions were scheduled for 2 a.m. on October 16, 1946. The ensuing sequence of events is where the ambiguity begins. The prison chaplain, Captain Henry Gereka, visited Göring in his cell the evening prior to his execution and observed that he appeared despondent. After Captain Gereka departed, Lieutenant John West arrived for his routine nightly inspection and discovered no forbidden items. West later reported that Göring seemed quite cheerful and conversed extensively with him during the search. At 9:30 p.m., Dr. Flecker and Lieutenant Arthur McClendon came to administer Göring his nightly pill and left 3 minutes later, at which point Private First Class Gordon Bingham commenced his guard duty shift. At 10:30, Private First Class Harold Johnson relieved Bingham. Johnson noticed Göring's body was rigid and motionless around 10:44 p.m. By the time the senior guard officers reached Göring's cell, He had died from cyanide poisoning. Göring had penned 2 farewell letters. The first refuted the trial's findings, while the second was an affectionate note to Emmy. He claimed to have always possessed a vial of cyanide and even composed a letter to Colonel Andrus boasting about it. In his stead, Ribbentrop was the first to be executed. The executions collectively lasted only an hour and 15 minutes. Their bodies were placed into coffins and transported to a crematorium. The facility had been heavily guarded in anticipation of civil unrest. Once the identities of the bodies were confirmed and they were cremated, their ashes were driven to the countryside and scattered into a ditch. Hermann Göring remains one of the more complex and intriguing figures within Hitler's inner circle. His distinguished record as a fighter ace in the First World War, coupled with his drug dependency, appreciation for the arts, and penchant for the finer things in life, undoubtedly render him a compelling character at first glance. However, he was also avaricious, self-serving, and ruthless. Repeatedly, he conspired against his adversaries within the Nazi regime, exploited his authority for personal enrichment, and consistently prioritized his own interests over those of the Nazi Party and even his country. Furthermore, his position as a key instigator of the final solution has ensured that regardless of how charismatic or courageous he might have been in his earlier years, he was ultimately corrupted by power, becoming just another mass murderer addicted to excess. What is your assessment of Hermann Göring? Do you believe he possessed the inner strength to defy Hitler, or was he fated to cowardice? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.